In this video, we'll be discussing information system security. In particular, we're going to be focusing on common security threats and safeguards you can take against them. This is an important lecture, as the safeguards we'll be covering can also help you personally, as we also face many of these same threats as individuals in our everyday lives when using the internet. But before we get into that, there is a required reading that you should review first. I recommend reading Chapter 12, Managing Information System Security and Privacy, from your textbook before viewing this lecture, and then attempting those MyLab MIS homework assignments after watching it. Without further ado, let's get into it by first discussing why cybersecurity is so important. You may feel it's not your job to worry about this, and that the IT department has it covered. Or perhaps that your business is too small and no one would bother targeting you. Well, the problem with that line of thinking is twofold. First, these days many attacks are automated and don't discriminate between targets based on size. They'll attack a home desktop computer just the same as they'll attack a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The second issue is that not all threats come from malicious human activity. We also face threats from natural disasters and unintentional human errors. You need to have a plan to keep your core business functions going in the event that something goes horribly wrong, and safeguards in place to mitigate such events from happening in the first place. Consider in your own personal life. What would happen if your personal laptop, cell phone, and all electronic devices were suddenly destroyed or stolen? How much data would you have lost? What would the impact be on your schoolwork? How many irreplaceable photos and videos would be lost forever? It's a scary thing to think about, and businesses face the same issues. The next big issue is the impact of security events on your public relationships. Having your business's name all over the news for being part of a large security breach is not going to have a positive impact on your relationships with customers, suppliers, and retailers that you do business with. Customers may not want to do business with you if they feel that it puts their personal information at risk, and suppliers and retailers may back out of agreements if they feel that being associated with you could impact their own business. Even if the security event was related to a natural disaster or human error, losing customer data or not being able to fulfill orders is not going to be looked favorably upon. The next big concern is protecting sensitive business data. Having your trade secrets, salary information, confidential agreements with suppliers, and more stolen could be devastating for your business. Once this kind of information is out there, it's impossible to take back. For instance, perhaps you have a preferred deal with a supplier that gives you better prices than your rivals or priority in the event of a supply shortage. Having this agreement public could put pressure on the supplier to give your rivals the same deal, or worse, cancel or renegotiate the terms of your existing agreement. The last concern is legal compliance. Many countries, including Canada, have laws that dictate how organizations handle personal information, and put that responsibility of protecting the data on the business collecting it. Lax security could put your business at risk for lawsuits and fines if it was found that you are not in compliance with these laws. In Canada, the major law governing the protection of personal information is PIPEDA, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. PIPEDA is particularly important to Canadian businesses as it makes it the duty of the organization to protect the personal information they collect and ensure it is used for only the purposes agreed to by the individual it pertains to. Failing to do this makes the organization liable for any damages that could occur from the misuse of the data. For example, if your business is storing personal information, such as credit cards, social insurance numbers, for your customers, and they're somehow leaked, and your business was found to not have adequate safeguards, you could be on the hook for paying any damages incurred by your customers as a result of the leak. Even if the sensitive data was never used maliciously, you could still have to pay for things like credit protection and monitoring for each and every one of your customers impacted by the leak. As a particular example of this, in 2012, Employment and Social Development Canada lost a portable hard drive containing the personal information of about 500,000 students who had OSAP loans between 2000 and 2006. This hard drive contained social insurance numbers, date of births, student loan balances, home addresses, and much more on each student. The hard drive was not password protected or encrypted in any way, and was the result of a backup that was simply left lying around the office for long periods of time until it was eventually shoved in an unlocked filing cabinet until it was reported missing. Despite there being no evidence of anyone ever accessing this data or using it for anything malicious, the government still faced a class action lawsuit that was supported by a report by the Privacy Commissioner's Office under the PIPEDA law. The government ended up settling for $17,500,000, and that's a massive amount for mishandling a backup and misplacing a hard drive with no evidence of the data ever being accessed. You should ask yourself as a business, can you afford not to secure your customers' data with penalties that steep? Not many businesses could survive a $17 million settlement like that. With that out of the way, we can start getting to the fun part, security threats and safeguards we can use against them. As I already touched on a bit, there are three main sources of security threats for your business. The first are human errors and mistakes. This would include accidental problems such as an employee misplacing a hard drive, accidentally deleting records from your database, or even something more dramatic like an employee driving a forklift through the data center. That may seem outrageous, but something like that has happened in real life. In 2007, a dump truck crash managed to take out Rackspace's Dallas data center after hitting a transformer and their backup generators failing to come on properly. Human errors and mistakes also include things like poorly written programs that cause data loss or leaks, or poorly designed procedures, such as leaving a hard drive with sensitive information in an unlocked filing cabinet. The next source of threats are natural events and disasters. For example, fires, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, avalanches, tornadoes, or any other act of nature. These are particularly bad as they don't just take out your data, but your physical infrastructure as well. The last source of security threats, and perhaps the most interesting one, are malicious human activities, including theft, the intentional destruction of data, hackers, malware, malicious emails, and even terrorist attacks. And yes, unfortunately, there have been terrorist attacks that have impacted data centers, such as the 2020 Nashville bombing of the AT&T network facility. This facility contained telephone exchanges and internet networking equipment, and the bombing resulted in AT&T phone, cellular, and internet outages across the United States, including 911 service in multiple areas. Still unclear if the AT&T attack was targeted specifically at AT&T, but the result was the same regardless of the attacker's motives. Let's now take a closer look at some of these malicious security threats. Now suppose you're managing the installation and setup of your business's first data center. Everything's going well in terms of acquiring the necessary hardware and software, and the installation is already underway. What do you think your first security consideration should be? Do you think it should be managing passwords, properly configuring the operating system on the new hardware, maybe setting access control policies, or perhaps something even more basic? I'll give you a few seconds to try to come up with an answer. And we're back. Well, the answer, which may surprise you, is the door, or more specifically, the physical security of your data center. If someone can access your sensitive IT infrastructure physically, they can damage or steal it. The risk is not just from outside attackers, but also from disgruntled employees. Another issue is that most computer security is based around the idea that the attacker does not have physical access to the system. In many cases, if the data is not encrypted, you can simply walk up to a server, pop out the hard drive, and walk away with a lot of sensitive and personal information. So what safeguards can we take to mitigate physical attacks? The first and most obvious is to lock the door. And by this, I mean control access to the facility by ensuring you have proper locks and doors. One thing I will never understand is companies' desire to make their data centers look cool with glass walls. Glass walls, or even worse, exterior windows, are a horrible idea for any sensitive infrastructure. They're easy to break into and have no purpose. Furthermore, exterior windows are also a risk for natural disasters, like tornadoes or hurricanes. The next is to have 24-hour security and monitoring of your facilities, ideally with a security guard on site. Access logs should also be maintained of every person that enters a sensitive area. With modern smart card-based locks, a record can be automatically created every time an employee taps their card on the lock to open the door. Another big safeguard is limiting access to only personnel that need to be there. If you're protecting a data center, then only employees whose job requires them to be in the data center should have access to it. Even if an employee is in a more senior role, if their job does not require them to be in the data center, they should not have access to it. This also helps if an access card is lost or stolen. And the last safeguard is having proper policies and procedures in place for securing and locking away sensitive information at the end of the business day. This can apply not only to sensitive infrastructure like data centers, but more everyday areas like employees' desks. Some organizations have strict rules that at the end of the day, all documents, paper, and so on has to be securely stored and locked in the drawers of their employees' desks. They enforce this by having security walk through the office and each night write up any employee that has anything on their desk. This may seem a bit drastic, but consider how much sensitive information might be found just laying around any office. A policy like this would have saved the government over $17 million, based on that lawsuit we discussed, if they had securely locked away that hard drive at the end of the night. Another question for you. Let's say you are an attacker and you want to get into a secure area. What do you think the most valuable tool would be to use to do this? Perhaps a lockpick, a crowbar, or maybe even a rock thrown through a window. What do you think would be the most effective tool to infiltrate a secure area? And we're back. And the answer is a regular, everyday clipboard. You'd be shocked at the places you can get into by simply wearing a dress shirt and pants, carrying around a clipboard, and looking mildly upset, and walking closely behind a group of employees through a secure door. If you look like you belong, most people will not bother you or even question your presence being there. This is something that I've actually done by accident before. Back when I was a TA and helping proctor exam, the professor was late and the exam room was still locked. Security walked up to me and handed me the box of exams and the key to the room without even asking who I was or if I was a TA, never mind checking my ID. Why did they pick me out of a large group of students that were also waiting? Because I was the only one without a backpack and a dress shirt and looking rather bored rather than stressing out and going through my notes. Fortunately, they were correct in their assumption and I was a proctor. However, it could have gone horribly wrong had I been a student impersonating a TA. And that brings us to our next security threat, pretexting or impersonating. Pretexting is when an attacker impersonates an employee, HR personnel, or senior management to try to manipulate real employees into divulging sensitive information or accessing a secure area. This could be as simple as the attacker calling up the IT help desk and claiming to have forgotten their password. Normally, the help desk will have security questions to verify the employee's identity, but far too often these are things like mother's maiden name, date of birth, or even the name of your high school. These are all things that you could easily find on a social media site like Facebook in a few seconds. Another related attack that you may have actually experienced yourself is getting a phone call claiming to be from someone in a position of authority, such as a police officer, the RMCP, Canadian Revenue Agency, or the Border Patrol. They'll attempt to intimidate you by saying that you owe back taxes, have a warrant out for your arrest, or are suspected of committing some kind of crime, or something similar, and you need to follow their directions exactly, or you'll be arrested. They'll then lead you through a convoluted series of steps that eventually leads you to having to pay them some kind of fee, usually in a silly way like through iTunes or Google Play gift cards. In reality, they are simply a scammer impersonating a person in authority, and you don't owe any taxes or have a warrant out for your arrest or anything like that. Let's listen to a record of what a call like this might sound like.
Hello. This call is from the Tax Department of Canada Revenue Agency. The reason behind this call is that there is a case, a lawsuit, that is getting filed under your name. The moment you receive this message, I need you to get back to me on my department division number. Now, if I don't hear a call from you, we will have to issue an arrest warrant under your name and get you arrested. So get back to me as soon as possible. Thank you.
If you called them back, they would continue to impersonate the CRA and eventually attempt to get you to send them money. So what safeguards can be put in place against attacks like these? Well, for calls like the one we just listened to, the best idea is to hang up, look up the real phone number of the organization that claims to be calling you, and call them back. Never give any personal information or money to someone over the phone without confirming their identity. The key here is to find the real phone number yourself, and don't use the one they gave you. Similarly, any request for sensitive information in the workplace should be followed up on through a second channel before releasing the information. For example, if you get an email from your boss that asks for a list of all the credit card numbers of your customers, don't just send them. First confirm the request with your boss over the phone or in person rather than using email again. Help desks and tech support should not use common questions like your mother's maiden name or date of birth to verify identities. Rather, policies should be put in place to ensure the method is secure, such as verifying the employee's identity in person before resetting the password or requesting copies of photo ID. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is educating your employees about pretexting attacks so they know what to look out for. The next security threat is phishing. In this type of attack, you are sent an email that is created to look like a legitimate email from a business or another employee that encourages you to click on a link to log into a website. When you click on the link, you'll be presented with a login screen that looks like a normal login screen for your organization or for the business that's sending you the email. However, in reality, it's actually a carefully crafted fake that's designed to steal your password. The fake site may even forward you onto the real site, so you may not even notice that something is wrong. The email address the sender is using will normally look legitimate, as they're either spoofing the address or have stolen the email account from someone else in your organization. Now, what do I mean here by spoofing? Well, email was created in the early days of the internet before security was a concern. As such, the email protocol does not have any authentication of the sender's identity. With a little know-how, it's trivial to send an email that looks like it's from any sender you want. The big giveaway that the email is not legitimate is the URL or the link they want you to follow. In this case, it's weebly.com, a domain Western definitely does not use. So why are attackers trying to steal your login? Well, there could be a number of reasons. They might want to access your email account to send spam or more phishing emails, or they might want to access your email because that will allow them to access other services by using a password reset email. In some cases, phishing emails will be for a service that's more important, like a bank account, which could do some real damage. Here we see a phishing email that targets RBC, a large bank in Canada. Either button would take you to a fake login page that would steal your account information. With all of that in mind, let's play a little game. I'll put up a few emails, and you try to guess if they're real or phishing attacks. Here's a mail I received recently. This is trying to share a PDF about an update to Western's privacy policies. The link leads to this URL. I'll give you a few seconds to take a look at this and try to decide if this is a phishing attack or not. Keep in mind, Western does use Microsoft services for sharing files. And we're back. Let's take a closer look at that URL. Now this one's a bit clever in how they're trying to hide the domain name. That M in Microsoft is not actually an M at all, but two R's. This is a common trick that's used in phishing attacks to try to hide that the domain name is not legitimate, and it can be hard to notice if you're not looking closely. This is a phishing email. Here's a second email to take a look at. It would seem to be a notice from Canada Post about a missing parcel that I have to reschedule. It's a bit small on the screen, so I'll show that a little bit more up close for the sender and the URL. Take a few seconds, look it over, and try to decide if this is a legitimate email or not. And we're back. The ULR in this one is to Amazon AWS, which is Amazon's cloud hosting service. ULR could be legitimate, as many companies do use Amazon's cloud hosting services, and this ULR does go to Amazon's server. However, the real giveaway here is the sender's address. That's not a Canada Post domain. In fact, it ends in .jp, which is the top-level domain for Japan. This again is a phishing email. Using Amazon's AWS is another way attackers try to seem legitimate, but anyone can purchase hosting services on Amazon's cloud. So how do we protect against these types of phishing attacks? Once again, educating employees is key. Training employees to check ULRs and the sender's address and to identify phishing emails can help reduce the number of employees that fall for these kinds of attacks. Another good strategy is not to follow links in emails. If you get an email from your bank, don't click on the link in the email. Instead, look up their page on Google, or if you know the domain name, type it into your browser directly. I even recommend bookmarking the login pages to important sites so you can quickly access them when needed and you know that they're legitimate. On the IT side of things, your IT department needs to actively maintain proper email filters and block lists to remove these emails before they ever reach your employees. This is easier said than done, however, as the domains and emails these attackers are using are constantly changing. There are some services that share block lists between organizations, and more sophisticated approaches, like utilizing machine learning to try to classify malicious emails, even without seeing them before. However, even these are not 100% effective, which is why the best safeguard is educating your employees. Lastly, multi-factor authentication should be used, so users need to do more than just have a password to log in to any important service. We'll talk more about this later in the lecture, but you should be familiar with it from logging into your Western email. Another common attack is sniffing or intercepting network packets. In Wi-Fi networks, all data is broadcast not just between your computer and the Wi-Fi router, but to anyone who's on the Wi-Fi network. Normally you don't notice or see this, but using special tools like a program called Wireshark, you can view the packets that are being sent by other computers on the Wi-Fi network. Unless a VPN or transport layer security is used, that's the HTTPS you see in ULRs, the packets are sent in plain text and readable by anyone on the network. For your own home network, this isn't a big deal, as you likely know everyone using it. But for a large public Wi-Fi network, it could be a very big security concern. For example, packets could include sensitive information such as content of emails, passwords on poorly designed sites that don't use encryption, your browsing history, and much, much more. To give an idea of what this looks like from the attacker's perspective, I've made a short clip of me using Wireshark to intercept some packets on my own home network. So right now we're looking at my desktop, and I have Wireshark open on the left and an internet browser on the right. I'm going to be doing this test on my own laptop, just capturing the traffic locally. However, it is possible to connect to a Wi-Fi network and capture the traffic with the right kind of Wi-Fi adapter. I don't want to capture anyone's real traffic, so we're just going to do it on my own desktop. So we're going to try by going to my website. And there we can see a bunch of packets have popped up on the left. The reason why we can see these in plain text is because you can see it's not using encryption. You can see there's a little cross through the lock, and it says the site is insecure because it's not using HTTPS. And one of the problems with this is that we can see what's actually being accessed, what websites that is. So we can see all these packets, and if we look at this first one up here, we can see the host, danielservos.ca. So one vulnerability here is that we could see what kind of websites people are accessing. Now, that might not be a big deal, but the big part comes in is when we actually get traffic that they're sending. So for example, I set up a little form, contact me form, just to test this out. We'll take a look at that. And I'll put in my name. And this could be just like a contact form on a website that you might be to send someone a message. And when I hit submit, Wireshark's going to have captured a few more packets. We can go down here, and here's the one I just sent. Now, here's the real danger, is when we go down here, we can see the actual data that was sent. We can see the name, Daniel Servos, and we can also see the message. My message, I hope no one sees this. So when we're not using encryption on websites like this one, it means anything we send back and forth either way can be intercepted on like a public Wi-Fi network. This could be a big deal on sites that don't use encryption because it might not just be something silly like this. It could be like your passwords, it could be your emails, it could be actual sensitive information. So that's why it is important that websites are set up to use encryption. Luckily, most of them these days are using HTTPS, but there are still a few out there that don't use it by default. Now back to our lecture on security and privacy. There are a number of safeguards we can take against sniffing attacks. The most effective of which is to use transport layer security, or TLS for short. What is TLS? It's a cryptographic protocol designed to protect computer communications that you're probably already using without knowing it. When you're surfing the web, if you see this lock symbol, it means that the website you're connected to is using TLS, and that communications between you and the site are encrypted. Another giveaway is the S in HTTPS. In theory, if a website supports this, it should not be possible to sniff the packets between you and the website. The problem with TLS, however, is that website has to support it. Most modern websites do, but there are still some out there that don't. Which brings us to our next safeguard, using a VPN. If you recall from our cloud computing lecture, VPNs encrypt the traffic between your computer and your business network. When using a public Wi-Fi access point, or any potentially unsecure network, such as a hotel's internet, it's a good idea to use a VPN if your organization has one set up. The last safeguard is to simply not use an unsecure connection, like public Wi-Fi, when dealing with sensitive data. Now moving on to denial of service, or DOS attacks. DOS attacks aim to make a machine or network unavailable for regular use. In this type of an attacker does not gain anything or compromise the system. Instead, their goal is to simply take it offline so others can't access it. This is typically accomplished by flooding the target machine with a large amounts of requests to overload it. When multiple machines are used as a source of traffic in this type of attack, we call it a distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS. A common example would be an attacker first compromising thousands of unsecure computers, anything that they can get their hands on, including home desktops, laptop servers, anything with an internet connection, and then using these devices to send millions of requests to the target system, which they wish to take down. The system is overloaded by the number of requests and is unable to respond to legitimate users. DOS can also happen accidentally due to misconfigured systems, or something as simple as an employee tripping over a cable and unplugging an important server. These type of attacks are a big issue, as they're growing bigger and bigger and more powerful every year, and even Google is not immune. In September of 2017, Google was hit with one of the largest known DDoS attacks to date that involved over 6 million requests per second, which added up to 2.5 terabytes of bandwidth per second. That'd be like sending your whole hard drive over the internet 3 times per second. And the craziest part of this is that this attack lasted for 6 months. Even though Google was able to handle this attack without degrading services to a significant degree, these types of attacks can be extremely expensive to deal with. If you're using, for example, a pay-per-use service, such as Elastic Cloud Computing Infrastructure, you now have to pay for the bandwidth and the additional computing resources that the attack creates. Creating safeguards against malicious DOS attacks is difficult and mostly out of the scope of this course. Most organizations outsource this kind of protection to services that specialize in these kinds of attacks. However, I will list 2 safeguards in simple terms. The first is upstream filtering. This is where you have your internet service provider filter out any malicious traffic and reroute it before it reaches your systems. This is easier said than done, however, as with distributed denial of service attacks, there are multiple sources of the traffic that all may look legitimate at first. Also, unless your ISP is close to the internet backbone, a large DDoS attack could even start impacting their systems. The second safeguard is using firewalls to block known sources of DOS attacks. However, this would only work for smaller or more limited attacks that are not distributed. Next up are brute force attacks. And this is simply where the attacker keeps attempting to guess a user's password by repeatedly attempting to log in using different combinations of passwords. Normally, the attacker will use an automated tool to keep attempting to log into the protected service, rather than trying to type the passwords by hand. This password can either be from a list of common passwords, or by literally trying every possible combination of characters. Fortunately, these types of attacks are normally easy to prevent. The most important safeguard is to limit the number of login attempts a user can make before their account is locked. For example, after 4 failed login attempts, the account may be blocked, and the user now has to contact their organization's help desk to have it unlocked. It can also be a good idea to block the source of these logins, such as temporarily blocking the IP address sending the login request from accessing the service for a set period of time after a set number of failed logins. The next safeguard is to once again use multi-factor authentication. If the password is cracked, the attacker will still not have everything they need to access the service. The last safeguard is to enforce proper password policies in your organization, so passwords are not easy to guess or brute force. You should ensure things such as a minimum password length, passwords contain special characters, capitals, and numbers, and that the user's password does not appear on a list of common passwords, common names, or words. One danger, however, of being too strict with password policies is that it can lead users to writing down passwords on things like sticky notes attached to their computer monitor, which adds new security threats. You need to strike a balance between security and usability in this regard. Next up is malware or malicious software. As the name would suggest, this is software that is intentionally designed to compromise the computer system it's executed on in some way. There are many different types of malware, but I'll go over a few of the most common ones here. The first are viruses. These are computer programs that, once executed, replicate themselves by modifying other programs to insert its own code, much like a biological virus does with cells or DNA. If successful, the infected program and files can then further spread the virus. Back in the day, these used to be mostly spread by floppy disks. But in modern times, they mostly spread through email attachments. Interestingly, the first computer viruses were not actually malicious, but experiments by computer researchers in the 1970s. By the 80s, they started to be created as jokes or purely for destructive reasons with no real benefit to the creator. In modern times, however, they usually have some objective, such as stealing information or computing resources. Worms are a similar idea to viruses, but instead of infecting other programs, they spread directly over computer networks by exploiting known security flaws. Worms use an infected computer to scan the network for other computers that might be vulnerable and attempt to infect them. These can be scary, as no action is needed on the user's part to infect the computer, and they can spread fast, spreading through large local area networks in a few days before anyone notices anything is wrong. Just like viruses, modern worms tend to have some payload or action they take once the computer is infected, such as stealing information or computing resources. Adware, or advertising-supported software, as the developers of such software call it, are programs that generate revenue by displaying advertisements to the user. These exist in a bit of a legal gray area, as they can be legitimate and part of the licensing agreement used for the software. This would be like ads and free apps on your phone that you might download. However, they fall into malicious or malware when they are installed unannounced to the user and inject ads into other programs, such as internet browsers. In some cases, they can be very obvious, such as pop-up ads all over your screen, but in other times it can be very subtle, such as altering search results or replacing existing ads on websites with their own. Adware can piggyback on other software you install, or it can be a payload of a virus or a worm. When software misleads users of its true intention, we call it a Trojan horse, after the Greek story of the fall of Troy. Spyware is a very similar concept to adware. In fact, many adware programs are also spyware. Spyware aims to gather information about a person or organization and send it back to the attacker. Again, like adware, this could be part of legitimate software that you agree to in the license, or malicious if it's done without the user's consent. More innocent spyware simply collects marketing information to target advertising at the user. But malicious spyware could do things such as record every key press on the computer, take screenshots or record the desktop, access webcams and microphones, steal files, or sensitive passwords. Spyware can be installed as part of another program, as a payload of a virus or a worm, or even part of a website you access in your browser. Next up are crypto miners. and these are a relatively new type of malware that attempts to steal your computer resources to mine cryptocurrency. Most cryptocurrencies are mined with CPU or GPU intensive operations that require a large amount of power and computing hardware. However, attackers have found that if they distribute this workload to thousands of slower and less powerful computers, they can still get results. Crypto miners may be installed in programs unbeknownst to the user and use system resources in the background. They may also even be parts of websites that run in your web browser while you're accessing the site. The security impact of this malware may seem low, but constantly stressing your hardware like this will lead to early failure and increased power usage, which you have to pay for. They also significantly slow down your computer and bring everything to a crawl. If your computer suddenly seems slower, it may be a good idea to check for malware. The last malware we will discuss is ransomware. In my opinion, this is the scariest one on the list. One day you'll turn on your computer, and out of nowhere you'll be greeted with a screen that looks like this, stating that your files have now been encrypted, and that the encryption key will be deleted in a set time limit if you don't pay the attacker. Normally the request will be to pay using a hard-to-trace method such as Bitcoin. While this would be upsetting for the individual, it can be devastating to large organizations, as ransomware tends to first spread to multiple computers before it's activated, so all the computers in your organization could have this pop up at once and completely shut down all of your business functions. A famous example of a ransomware attack on an organization was the 2021 ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, America's largest pipeline of refined products such as gasoline and jet fuel. About 45% of all the fuel consumed on the east coast of the US arrives via this pipeline system. A compromised password allowed a hacker to install ransomware on critical infrastructure, forcing Colonial Pipeline to shut down all operations until they paid the ransom of 75 bitcoins. Might not sound much, but at the time that was $5 million. Unfortunately for Colonial Pipelines, the decryption tool was so slow that they eventually gave up on it and fell back on the business's continuity plans for large-scale disasters to restore operations. The resulting fuel shortages caused by this attack led to a number of flight delays and cancellations, and even some airlines to switch to different jet fuel suppliers. Gasoline shortages, also partly caused by panic buying from the attack, led to about 71% of gas stations in northern Southern Carolina to Southern Virginia to run out of fuel, as well about 81% of gas stations in Washington, D.C. All of this caused by one compromised password, and not following best practices for password management. With that scary story out of the way, how can we prevent these kinds of malware attacks? Well, the first and perhaps most obvious safeguard is to install antivirus and malware software on your computer systems. But just installing it is not enough. You have to ensure that it is performing frequent scans, as well as frequently updating its definitions. Definitions are the predefined rules and patterns created by the antivirus vendor for identifying malware, and they need to be updated regularly as malware is not static. New malware is being created every day, so definitions need to keep up with the developments. One anti-malware program I highly recommend, in addition to those built into your operating system, is Malwarebytes. It's a pay-to-use software, but they also include a free version with some more limited capabilities. The next safeguard is ad blocking software for your internet browser, such as uBlock Origin. This is a free browser extension that removes ads from websites and even YouTube videos. Its primary purpose is blocking ads, but it also helps remove trackers, adware, and spyware found in web pages, which can help reduce your exposure to them. Keeping up with system and software updates is also extremely important. Recall that worms spread through security flaws, and most of the updates you see to Windows and other software are aimed at addressing and correcting these security flaws. Your IT department should have a set of policies for doing frequent software updates and systems in place to ensure that all employee workstations have all security updates installed as soon as they're available. It's also important to actively monitor your organization's local area network for suspicious traffic. Worms spread through networks and often attempt to scan other computers for vulnerabilities. Intrusion detection systems can monitor traffic in a LAN and flag anything that looks like it might be generated by a worm or could be evidence of a system being compromised by an attacker. Essentially, these systems act like network sniffers we discussed earlier, but for positive purposes. They can also help flag misuse of corporate networks by employees. Next up are backups. Proper and frequent backups can help mitigate the impact of things like malware. We'll get into this more a little bit later in the lecture. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, is properly educating your employees about computer security. Employees should understand the dangers of downloading suspicious email attachments or files from questionable websites, and your policies and procedures should make employees accountable for following the best cybersecurity practices. Now we'll be moving on to our next topic, identification and authentication. But what are identification and authentication? Well, identification is the action or process of identifying a user of the system. This is typically done by the user providing something like a username, employee ID, social insurance number, or maybe even just their full name. Identification doesn't prove who they are, it's just a statement about who they're claiming to be. Authentication, on the other hand, is the process of providing or verifying that identity. For example, by providing a password, security token, or biometrics such as a fingerprint. There are a number of different types of authentication that can be used to verify a user's identity, the most common of which are passwords, which you're already very likely familiar with. As I mentioned previously, an important safeguard when it comes to passwords is ensuring that your organization has a proper password policy to prevent brute force attacks or attackers from guessing your password. In addition to ensuring a minimum length and presence of special characters, password policies should also attempt to prevent password reuse. That is, using the same password on multiple sites. This can be incredibly dangerous, as if one site you use is compromised, all of your other accounts will be as well. Attackers know people reuse passwords, so they'll use any leaked credentials that they can get their hands on other websites and services. An easy way to handle this is to use a tool like a password manager to keep track of and generate new passwords for each service you use. On the screen right now, I have a screenshot of KeePass, a free and open source password manager. Most password managers use encryption to secure your password database, so it can be only used by you. Another useful tool are sites like haveibeenowned.com, which has a massive database of services that have been compromised and the accounts involved. You can input your email or phone number, and the site will show you a list of sites that you have accounts with that have been involved in data breaches in the past. If you see your account listed, it would be a good idea to change your password on that service. Some password managers will even check these databases for you to ensure that you're not using a password that's already compromised. The next authentication type are smart cards. Now, you may have not heard of smart cards before, but all of you watching already have at least one, and that would be your student ID. If you're not a full-time student, your London bus pass may also be a smart card. These are cards that have a chip in them that can be read either wirelessly using NFC or by making contact with pads on the card. Western uses them for a variety of functions, including unlocking doors, bus passes, and authenticating your identity when you go to Student Center in person. The next authentication method are security tokens. Modern USB security tokens look like small USB keys, but with a small button on them. They work similarly to smart cards, but allow you to log into services on your computer. They come in a number of form factors, and some even include wireless connectivity, such as allowing you to tap them on your phone or connect them with Bluetooth. I highly recommend getting one of these if you're able to. As a Western student, they are compatible with Western's Duo and can be more secure and less troublesome than having to get a phone call or deal with your cell phone each time you want to log into your email. They tend to be relatively cheap depending on the type you get and if it's a name brand. One-time passwords, or OTP for short, are another type of authentication method that you have likely experienced without even knowing their name. Perhaps you've received a call like this to log into Gmail or another website.
Hello. Thank you for using Google Phone Verification. Remember, you should not share this code with anyone else, and no one from Google will ever ask for this code. Your code is 6240113. Goodbye.
The idea here is that your identity is being verified through a second channel to prove that you at least have access to the phone on record for that user. The numbers they send you are different each time, so if an attacker intercepts them, they will be useless when they go to log in, as they'll be different the next time. Phone calls are not the only way OTP is used. They can also be sent through text messages, or generated by an application on your phone. Shown here is a screenshot of Google Authenticator, which generates new codes every 30 seconds. There is also hardware tokens for generating these codes, although this is becoming rarer to see as they're being replaced by USB security tokens. Shown here is an OTP token that generates a new code every time you press the button. These can also be embedded in plastic cards like this one. The last authentication method we will discuss are biometrics. This category includes technologies such as fingerprint scanners, retinal scans, palm scans, and facial recognition. Fingerprints and face scans are becoming popular on smartphones and tablets, as they're quicker than typing a password on an on-screen keyboard. However, these technologies can have issues when used for authentication. There have been numerous studies that have shown that it is indeed possible to spoof fingerprints and fool many common fingerprint readers. And this raises a big question. What happens if your fingerprint data or face scan data is stolen or compromised? You can't change your fingerprints. Once they're compromised forever. Now that we've taken a look at all these authentication methods, you might be asking, which one should I use for my information system? And the answer is that you should be using not just one method, but at least two. We call this Multifactor Authentication, or MFA for short. And it's based around the principle that for best security, you should provide something you know, such as a password, something you have, such as a security token, and in some cases, something that you are, such as a fingerprint. We call each of these a factor. As biometric scanners are not widely available, most services that implement MFA tend to only use passwords and a secondary factor based on something you have, such as a security token, smart card, or a device that can guarantee a one-time password, such as a cell phone. Western, for example, uses a MFA service called Duo that supports security tokens, smartphones, and landlines as a second factor. The last authentication topic that I'll mention is single sign-on, or SSO. This allows users to sign into multiple independent systems using the same credentials that are managed centrally by one organization. For example, Western uses single sign-on to allow faculty, staff, and students to log on to all of Western systems using one identity. You can log into OWL with the same credentials you can log on with Student Center or Office 365 or Zoom. Your identity is centrally managed, so that changes in your password would change your password on all of these services at once. The advantage is that users do not have to remember a different username and password for each service, and IT can easily manage accounts in one place. The downside with SSO is that if the SSO service goes down, no one can log into any of Western services. The other disadvantage is that if your account is compromised, the attacker will have access to all of the services protected by the SSO system. Let's now move on to the topic of disaster preparedness. As the name would imply, this is the act of planning and preparing for disasters, including malicious attacks such as ransomware, loss of computing infrastructure caused by a natural disaster, crime or terrorists, or the accidental incidents such as the intern deleting all the files or records in a database. One of the first and most important disaster preparedness tasks are making and maintaining data backups. Recall that information is your business's most important resource, and losing it could be devastating to your organization. Now, you may think that you can just copy all of your data to another hard drive, and you're good, right? Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple or easy. Let's take a look at an example of how this could go wrong, from my own experience. The year was 2015. At the time, I was a PhD student with the department and a teaching assistant. I'd been assigned to mark essays for CS1030, an essay course that covered the history of computation and current trends in technology. Unfortunately, I don't think the course is still taught. In any case, I just finished marking an assignment where students had to write about a present-day figure related to technology. Almost all the students had chosen to write about Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. Regardless how you feel about those figures, I can tell you that after reading 100 essays about how amazing they are, you'll never want to hear about them or read another word about them. Knowing how badly I did not want to repeat that experience, I made sure to back up all of the marking on a USB key and placed it next to my laptop in my bedroom. I figured I could upload everything to OWL in the morning, and I went to sleep. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? It's backed up, right?
6 hours later.
Well, apparently a lot could go very, very wrong indeed. The remains of the laptop were melted to what was left of my desk, and the USB key was never seen again. Fortunately, everyone made it out unharmed, including pets, and my research and thesis were backed up remotely to the cloud. The assignments, not so much, and remarking them was not any more fun the second time. Overall, I was very lucky in this case. Insurance paid for everything, and I only lost a few days of data. But the moral of the story is that simply having a backup hard drive sitting around locally is not enough. And although disasters like this are not common, they also are not unheard of. Your organization must have a good backup policy that includes having backups stored in geographically remote locations to prevent a large-scale disaster destroying both your production systems and your backups at the same time. As we discussed at the start of the lecture, with the case of that lost student loan hard drive, it's also important that backups are properly secured, both physically and digitally using encryption. It's easy to think that backup systems are harmless and only prevent security threats, but they contain the same sensitive information as your production systems, and your backups being compromised can be just as disastrous as if the data in your live database was stolen. Another big consideration is the frequency of your backups. If you can't lose a single day of data, then you should be backing up at least daily, if not more. And you should not consider your information system to be backed up unless it's both backed up and you've tested recovering your systems from them. Far too often, organizations assume that just because they have made a backup, that restoring it will not be an issue. But a simple bug could lead to backups being incomplete or corrupted. It's critical to test and rehearse recovery operations to ensure that they actually work. The last consideration is that you should have both cold and hot backups. What do I mean by cold and hot? Cold backups are backups that are offline and not connected to any computer. For example, copying the data to a hard drive, encrypting it, and then placing it in a secure remote location. Hot backups would be backups that are online and connected to your network in some way to enable quick and remote backups. The reason why you need cold backups is that a security incident, such as ransomware, could spread through your network and infect everything including your backup systems if they are accessible. Backups are great, but there's still an issue here. Sure, you have great backups, but if your whole data center just went up in smoke, what are you going to restore those backups onto? Large organizations need plans not only for data loss, but also loss of physical infrastructure. One solution is to have a secondary remote facility that you can cut over to if something goes wrong with your primary site. These secondary sites tend to fall into one of three categories: hot sites, cold sites, and warm sites. Hot sites are remote sites that already have all required equipment and technology infrastructure ready to go to continue all business operations during a disaster. They tend to be expensive, as you need to maintain a second site with the same infrastructure and may get very little use or benefit out of it most of the time. The upside is that if a disaster does happen, you'll have minimal downtime as you already have everything set up. Cold sites are remote sites that are mostly an empty space with minimal technology infrastructure. If a disaster occurs, your business would have to provide and set up the equipment before it can continue operations. The advantage of this is it tends to be cheaper, but the drawback is that you will have a longer downtime after a disaster occurs. A warm site is a mix of both strategies. For example, perhaps you have some of the network equipment already set up and ready to go, but during a disaster you might need to install and set up the servers and restore your backup. A key part of cutover operations like these is identifying mission-critical systems and resources that need to be present at the sites to continue business operations. You should know exactly what systems are required for your business to run and what are optional or nice to have. A second important point is that you need to train and rehearse how to perform these cutover operations. Just like fire drills, you should have recurring disaster preparedness drills where you simulate cutting over to a second site and restoring backups. Our last topic for this lecture will be responding to security incidents. Let's say this just popped up on all the desktop computers in your office. What are you going to do? What is your first course of action? How are you going to respond? What employees are you going to call for help? Where are those employees' contact information if this is a weekend or if they're on vacation? You should have answers to all of these questions before a security incident takes place. This means having a detailed reporting and response plan that includes things such as off-hour contact information of critical IT and security employees, and the steps to start taking immediately to reduce potential losses. Speed is of essence, as malware like this can spread through a network fast, and an attacker could be copying information off your system as you sit around trying to figure out what to do. Centralized reporting of incidents is also important. In some cases, disclosure of data breaches are required by law if they impact customer privacy. So it's important to have this information in one place so it can be processed correctly according to local laws. Centralized reporting also allows your IT or security departments to have a whole picture of the incidents that are occurring in your organization and ensure the right personnel are responding to them, or if any changes to procedures or software are required. Lastly, once again, practice and training are critical for proper incident response. And this is a recurring theme in this lecture. Educating employees about security is critical, and training should be tailored to their role in the organization and their technical background. And that brings us to the end of our discussion on security and privacy, and the end of Chapter 12. If you've not already read Chapter 12, I do highly recommend reviewing it. I cover some of the same topics in this lecture, but the textbook takes a much more people and procedure-driven approach to security that I think could also be valuable to explore. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.